I'm Hilary Robertson. Welcome to the latest episode of Harmonious World.
We rented a small house. We bought very little furniture.
For this episode, I'm joined by Jeff Beal, who is a highly prolific composer of music for film and television.
And sat on apple boxes rather than chairs.
He's won 5 Primetime Emmy Awards for his scores for House of Cards, Rome, Carnivale, Dreamscapes, and Oliver Stone's The Putin Interviews, as well as for film scores including Shock and Awe, which was directed by Rob Reiner. He's been nominated for 19 Primetime Emmys. That's a staggering number. Beal is very interesting in crossing the line between classical and jazz, and there is improvisation in his music. What we're talking about for this episode is an album called The Paper-Lined Shack, which has an absolutely fascinating story. You're listening to the single title track now, and I'm going to get into this whole thing with Jeff. I've only got 15 minutes with him, but I'm going to get into this whole thing about his great-grandmother Della, because this album is based on her memoir. There are 5 tracks called Carefree Girl, The Red Chair, The Paper-Lined Shack, which is what you're listening to, Our Garden, and My Heart. And that is all performed by Hila Pittman and Leonard Slatkin conducting the Eastman Philharmonia. And then there's a second bit, which features the New Hollywood String Quartet, and it's called Things Unseen. And that's got 4 tracks called Ghosts, Spirits, Angels, and Gnomes. And at the end of this podcast, you'll hear an extract from Gnomes. I'm hoping, depending on time, that I can talk to Jeff about My Heart in the middle of this, because the lyrics are just beautiful. Obviously it's sung beautifully by Hila, but My Heart, which is on Paper-Lined Shack, is just, it's got the most beautiful lyrics. And these are actually curated by Jeff's wife, Joan. And Joan is also a soprano. There's a fascinating story about this whole album, and I'm really looking forward to speaking to Jeff. And I hope you enjoy listening in.
Hello, Hilary. How are you?
Hello, Jeff. I'm great, thank you. Yes. Thank you for joining me to talk about this album. I absolutely love it. I love the concept behind it and the music. It's just brilliant.
Oh, thank you so much, Hilary. Really appreciate it. Yeah, it was a special one. It's a really special one to do. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Absolutely. This album, The Paper-Lined Shack, came from a very, very interesting place. So tell my listeners the story.
My wife and I were moving about, 15 years ago or 10 at least. And we were going through an old box of memorabilia, and these pages popped out that turned out to be from my mother. They were a memoir of my great-grandmother, Della. And I kind of knew the story of her. She was the mother of my grandfather, Harold. And I heard it from Harold that, Harold's father died when he was very young. But here we had the story of Della, the mother of what was eventually 6 children, what it was like to be moving to Idaho and eventually being widowed. And the way she wrote about it was so beautiful. Actually, my wife, Joan, who's a wonderful writer, read some of these lines and she said, "This is amazing. This could be like an opera or something, We're musicians, so we think that it could probably be a short story or a novel too. But and so we put it away and forgot about it. And fast forward about 10 years, and I received this commission from the St. Louis Symphony for a new work in honor of Leonard Slatkin. And I thought about this wonderful soprano, Hila Pittman, who I'd worked with once before, who was just an amazing performer, and knew she worked with Leonard. And so I proposed to Leonard the idea of a song cycle for Hila, and Leonard loved it. They'd worked together quite a bit. I did not have a text at this point. I thought, knowing Hila's personality and just what a wonderful performer she was, I wanted some sort of female driven, strong character, that would really give her something to really sink her musical and dramatic soul into. And then Joan and I were out for a walk, and I said, "Hey, what about those pages, of Della's?" And we felt like a light bulb moment, for us both. That let's go back and revisit that. And so that was kind of how it was born. And it's called The Paperline Shack. It's a cycle of 5 songs, little episodes from Della's life. Really, the central one being the one where she loses first her mother, and then her husband Franklin dies shortly thereafter. And yeah, that's how it became.
Yeah, and Joan obviously is an important. I mean, she's another soprano, and
Yes,
she's been an important part of the curation of this of the libretto and the whole project, really.
absolutely. She. It's funny because we've kind of read the diary separately of each other. And then we sort of had a meeting on what we thought were the good bits, and we kind of both agreed. There was just some wonderful episodes and little descriptions of things that just felt like such special little episodes. One was a bicycle she got when she was a little girl. That was sort of a great little visual metaphor for how she felt and what it was like growing up. She was a only daughter of a big family of boys, and a red chair that her father had saved for the first granddaughter in the family. Turned out her first daughter, who was Rosella, got the red chair, and so on.
Yeah.
My favorite movement was really Our Garden, which was about there's this wonderful way in which her writing had some qualities which really spoke to me. And it's funny, I just had a visit from my cousin who I hadn't seen in about 30 years, and we were talking about this very thing. And it's a very a lot of my extended and immediate family is from the Idaho area, which in America you think of this sort of agrarian culture, pioneers, people who sort of traveled across the country in various ways. Della didn't come over in a covered wagon, but it was not far from that kind of an adventure for her. And so there's a beautiful sort of humility and also optimism in her writing, and a little sense of humor, which I love that spirit that she had, the way that hardship was something that happens to everyone, but the poetry of that life and the way of dealing with that really I felt was powerful and quite beautiful.
Yes, I like Our Garden as well, but my favorite movement is My Heart. And
Mm.
I've pulled up the lyrics actually from what I was given, and I love that final stanza. It was love that we planted in the garden. There our hearts bloomed, our hearts opened. Carry my heart.
Yeah, and I have to give credit where credit is due. That was the one that was the most extrapolated from the journal, and that was actually Joan really really crafted those words. And that is really, as much as it's the voice, it's the writing of Joan channeling the voice of Della.
This seems like the ideal spot in my interview to break off and listen to the final stanza of My Heart.
It certainly is the emotional payoff of the whole piece. And I love that. I love that you singled out that movement, because I remember when I was reading the piece through with Hila, who is a mother, and obviously I'm a father, but my wife is a mother. And I think that's something really powerful about Della's soul and her connection to her life was really her children. And the way that we give our children something of ourselves and we try to, um, you know, transmit something beautiful. And so the idea of your children, I mean, I think our son's 27, but I think no matter how old your kids are, you're always a parent and they're always your children. And my wife had the best description for that, having a child. I don't know if this is from her who said it, but it's like having your heart outside your body somewhere. It really is an
Yeah.
extension of yourself. So that very much was in Della's person. This is why, like immediately after these horrible things happened to her, she sort of immediately sort of gathered herself together and realized that she had a new mission, and her mission was to raise these kids on her by herself. And obviously she, like most people, most single mothers with 6 kids, obviously she got some help eventually, but that still emotionally is a huge lift.
Yeah. And I think that line between Della and Joan and Hila is of, those three strong women, really, that really comes across. I love Hila's voice. She performed on Danae Xanthi Mythologies, and I interviewed Danae a couple of months ago. And Hila's voice came to me. I had seen her name and thought, oh, that's the same woman. But as soon as I heard it, I went, so recognizable,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah, I think what's amazing about, well, she has an amazing vocal instrument, obviously, but also the way she can deliver text um, in the most vocally not simple
Yeah.
types of musical phrases is really amazing. In her hands and her instrument, the paper line shack really became, when we do it live, I realized, oh, this is like a little one act opera. It's a vehicle for her. She has some props and she has a letter and she sits down and she stands up, and it's been fun to see the reaction from people who hear it, because one of the things that only thing I was a little nervous about, and obviously, and even in releasing this music, I mean, I'm not a young guy. I've done this a lot of times, but I felt especially vulnerable putting this music out in the world, and I realized, well, this is just so personal. But the nice thing I've realized about the piece is, like, even after from the first day when we first premiered it in St. Louis, is like every family has these type of stories. We all have sort of, there's a universal quality, I think, to good stories and good writing. And Della certainly didn't know that her memoirs were fodder for a song cycle, but really there's truth in there. There's truth in there. And, so the fact that so many people have responded to it and obviously seen their own stories in the piece through Hila's instrument has been really, really wonderful.
It's amazing. And to have obviously Leonard Slatkin conducting, is fabulous as well. So I mean, this is a star-studded album, really, isn't it?
Yeah, no, and I have Leonard to thank for a lot of things, but he's really the reason this recording exists, because after the premiere in St. Louis, we had a concert that Leonard was presenting at my alma mater, Eastman School of Music, and on the heels of getting ready to do that, thank God, and this was 2019, about November of 2019, which now seems very auspicious. But he said, why don't we record it when they're there? I said, oh, what a great idea. And Eastman came on board, and the Philharmonia, which is the sort of the sort of like the star symphony of the school. That's when you're a senior and you're the best at what you do. You get to play in this orchestra. They did a wonderful job. And so, Leonard has, he's a specialist of American music. He's a big champion of new music. And to his credit, he doesn't, because his family, both his parents played in the studios. They were both principal violin and cello, respectively, I think at Fox and Warner Brothers. And they formed the Hollywood String Quartet, which is an amazing, amazing ensemble. But Leonard, seeing me as a guy who's known mostly as someone who writes for the screen, he didn't, I love the fact that he didn't have any problem seeing me also as someone that had a voice that could live on the concert stage as well.
I think that's interesting. The American music has so many links to the American film and television industry. There are so many of the current modern contemporary classical music composers who have either done as you have done, which is composed for television or whatever, but they've been influenced by it. It's a fascinating, there's that drawing together of those two strands of American culture.
No, I love it. In fact, and it's funny, we just recently moved to New York, so I've been sort of forming a lot of friendships with some people I already knew and reconnecting with people I know more in the concert composer world. And it's wonderful to hear they all seem interested in this if they haven't done it. And many of them have. I just watched a wonderful score by Nico Muhly that he did for this Apple series called, oh gosh, I'm going to forget the name of it. Pachinko, and beautiful scoring. So I also feel like, this is a generational thing that, I just feel like that if you're a composer in 2021 or 22 or 23, the whole world is open to you, and film, and of course it's entertainment, it's commerce, but it is all. I also really firmly believe that good cinema it's just like anything else, is another form of literature, and it really is a form of literature that was born in its present sort of practiced state, and really it is feels very American to me. The world of film music.
Yeah, very much so. Talk to me a little bit about your background. We're both babies of 1963, so talk to me about your sort of how your music came about. Where did it come from?
Yeah, and it's funny because there's genetic links to it, and I think the older I get, the more I get fascinated by, like, where did I come from? Where did this, where is this? So I was born into a family not immediately of professional musicians, but there was definitely a lot of musicians in the family. My mom's a pianist. My grandmother was a pianist. And my grandmother on my father's side was an especially musical lady. Her name was Irene. And she was a wonderful improviser and loved all types of music. And so I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was a trumpet player. I was sort of toying around at the piano. So there was the composer was somewhere inside, but I remember when I started taking the trumpet, I was only doing it a few years, really. I was over at Grandma Irene's house once, and she went into her record collection and pulled out two vinyl records for me. Of course, that's all we had then was vinyl.
Yeah.
And the first one was Miles Davis Sketches of Spain. And the second one was another Miles Davis record, Kind of Blue. So, wow, that's can't get much better than that. So, that's, and I also found out later, actually, after she passed, that she also, earlier in her life, in I think it was Boise, Idaho, was a pianist for silent movies. So she would sit there and sort of, they would give them a series of themes, and she would sit there and when you see the way a modern film composer work, it's not that much unlike a silent movie pianist. You're sitting with the keyboard and you're looking up at the screen, and so obviously that was a big part of it. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 60s and the 70s, which was an amazing place for music. I mean, you had amazing classical music. I played in the Oakland Youth Symphony. I think, aside from playing jazz, which was really when I think my artistic brain just blossomed, and I discovered a lot of that immediacy of it. That was really, I suppose, when the composer in me really realized I was a composer too, because jazz improvising is essentially, obviously, a form of composition. But I think the other really important formative event in my life was playing in the Oakland Youth Symphony in the trumpet section. And we had a great orchestra and a great, really adventuresome conductor who never wanted to program to the orchestra. We were doing Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. And I just remember sitting in the middle of that orchestra and hearing all those sounds, and just like my brain exploded. I thought, this is what I want to do. Yeah. I want to be a composer. I want to write music. And, it's interesting. Obviously, it wasn't film music, but it was a ballet. And so I think the guiding sort of inspiration for my music has really been storytelling. I love telling stories in music, whether it's a concert piece or a film score. If it can be more abstract, not necessarily with the program attached to it, but it's some sort of story in there.
Right. And it's interesting, your film and TV credits are amazing. They're really good, and there are a lot of great stories of our age, aren't they? A lot, House of Cards, for instance. It's very much kind of 20th century.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting. I think there's definitely my musical voice has sort of found its way into, well, I've told a lot of wonderful stories. Another series I love doing on a completely different, a dramatic side was, Monk starring Tony Shalhoub, which was a
Right.
comedy, was sort of
Yeah.
a dramedy about a detective with OCD. Uh, and there's also been I've done a lot of documentaries, and I've also been very lucky to do a lot of movies about real life people. I think my first film that really felt like the breakout for me was this film that Ed Harris did back in, I think, 2000 about Jackson Pollock. And so there's been several films that deal with painting. And it's funny, I don't get to choose the opportunities that come to me, but it's a little bit like the law of attraction. People find out what you do and they start to come to you for various projects. So when I look back on the films I've been fortunate enough to work on, I feel very, very lucky and like, yeah, those are the right projects for me. Those felt like a good fit.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great. And I love the way you talk about that link between improvisation and classical. When I started this podcast just over 2 years ago, it was my lockdown project. And when I started, I thought, right, well, I'm going to interview any musicians. I don't care what genre they are. And it's amazing how frequently it's impossible to put people in a box. And I think things like the Grammys and all these things come up that try and still categorize, and actually for many of us, the music that we create doesn't fit neatly into one box.
I couldn't agree more. And I think this is probably more natural for the current generation because they live in that world. They live in the world where they're a click away from listening to, Mahler to, Kanye West to Coldplay to whatever, to George Crumb or, John Adams. So, this eclectic idea, I think is a powerful one. And it's been really important to me because I think that's part of what I love, especially about the world of film, because I never had a director say, and it's interesting that the most sort of commercial aspect of music, in a way, often has felt the most free because I never had a director say, well, you can't mix, polka with hip hop and jazz. You know what I mean? If that is what the story needs, well, then go for it. So there's a way in which the sort of eclectic aesthetic is welcome there. But I think it's an interesting question, an interesting thing to discuss because we probably never had more content and more music being created. So at the end of the day, why are you doing it, and what is its value? I think are two important existential questions.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a COVID thing too, but I think like COVID in a way was like a magnifying glass that almost made us think really deeply about the why part of it, like why we do music and what is its value to us. And this record was not born. I mean, this piece was not written after COVID, but it was interesting working on it and mixing it and everything and editing it during, because it made me think like, yeah, this is the kind of stuff I want to spend my time on, stuff that's meaningful and personal and that speaks to people and makes, not necessarily that it's easy to listen to or it's just comforting, but the idea of I also think a lot about the idea of sort of a post-religious society, and so like I feel like music has this function in modern life of being the one place, now that we can go back to concert halls and we know that amazing feeling when you first go back into a room and hear live music again.
Yeah.
It's the one place where you go into a room where you turn off your devices and you shut off the screens and you're just quiet and you sit and you listen and you have this moment with other human beings. And that that feeling, that sort of reverence of that moment, and the discovery and the provocation and the wonderful sort of conversation that happens in that room with other people that's nonverbal is extremely powerful. And I think I guess it's its own answer for me in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it does transcend all those things about genre and everything
Yeah.
else. We can't stop talking about this without discussing Things Unseen, which is the string quartet. So this is, I couldn't get my head around this. So it's 4 movements for the 4 instruments of the string quartet. And there are these, it's almost like these conversations, and it all intricately linked, and it's amazing. So is there a link to the Paperline Shack?
Not directly. I mean, we had already had this piece recorded, and I wanted to release a recording. And so I had half a record and I needed the other half. Now we're in COVID, and I'm thinking about, I want to record something. I had some other orchestral pieces that were sort of possibly waiting in the wings, but I thought about this string quartet, which had written quite a bit, several years prior to this, but had never been released as a recording. And I thought about this, and as a test, I just put it on the same. I put a playlist together, and I thought this really kind of works.
Yeah.
So it's a more rhythmic piece. It's a little more formal compositional in a way. It's a little more about, it's chamber music. It's a string quartet. There's more about counterpoint, but there's something pretty direct about it, which felt like it didn't sort of break the spell of the place that the songs put you in. So once the vaccines came out, I went back to Los Angeles, and there was a wonderful group in LA, the New Hollywood String Quartet, who had actually done it on a concert a few years prior. And I love the way they played it. So we all got together and recorded it. And there's a funny coincidence in the fact that the name of this group is the New Hollywood String Quartet. They're wonderful players. Several of them are the principals of the LA Chamber Orchestra. And of course, they took their name from the original quartet that was founded by Leonard Slatkin's parents. So go figure, but this is I guess the other connection in a way, without a big story, is the idea of Things Unseen. Sort of goes to what I was talking about earlier about, the spiritual, the transcendent qualities in music. For some reason, as a language, one of the things that I think constantly brings me back to music and draws me in when I'm writing is this idea of it's the connection to a deep part of human feeling, experience, and spirituality in some way, not in a dogmatic way or a religious way overtly, but just something that really points to that part of ourselves, the mystery of it. I think I'm a big believer in that. So this piece was sort of, in a way, sort of to conjuring up some of those feelings in music, I suppose.
It segues nicely, doesn't it? The 2 pieces with their separate movements, they do segue nicely. So,
thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I'm so grateful.
Oh, my pleasure, Hillary. I'm glad. I'm very sad there was a pandemic, but I'm really thrilled it encouraged you to start this wonderful show that you're doing.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation. It was just such a pleasure. What you're listening to now, as I said at the beginning, is Gnomes from Jeff Beal's Things Unseen for String Quartet. I hope this finds you well. I have a lot of interesting guests lined up, so keep listening, and please do rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.